I'm a little bit insecure about asking my question. I'm not a particularly literary person, but I give it a go anyway. You talked earlier about the book about Ronald Reagan, and it had happened, it was written before he actually became president, and books that can predict and influence. And the one that everyone references now, well, two of them to the point where cliche, is of course 1984 and Brave New World. And reality seems to be a kind of a merge of the two of them, where we do have this aggressively surveillance society and this hedonistic society, but it's all by consent. So we allow, all these companies to have all this information because it's just convenient and handy for us. And yet, as we've seen, Trump and the world appear to get more and more dangerous, it just seems to me really odd that we can glibly reference this as we recognise what's happening, and yet detach from it and don't really seem to care. And there seems to be some kind of dysfunction there between what we've been told would happen and we see it happening, and yet for many people they're just carrying on regardless anyway.
Yeah, but I think, I remember having a row on, actually not a row, but a discussion on the ferry to Jura in the Hebrides, where Orwell wrote 1984, and if you ever get the opportunity to go up to the house where he wrote it, it's called Barn Hill. It's an astonishing place. And this guy recognized me and sort of said, do you not think we're now in the world of 1984? But you made the point very well and very, very articulately. It's not the world of 1984. Orwell's vision was predicated on a certain kind of 1948 conception of what totalitarian societies were like. And the kind of totalitarianism we live under is a commoditized totalitarianism, whereas, of course, poor old Orwell really mostly feared the Soviet Union at that point and a Soviet model. I mean, his Airstrip 1 is very, very kind of echt Soviet in that way. But, I suppose that you're making the point that even when literature warned people, they still went on and did it, and that they lazily produce the cliche now. Whereas if they'd read the book at the time, then it wouldn't have happened. But actually, I would have spoken about Orwell, who is such a kind of sacred cow in the English literary world, really, and recall, yes, 1984, but more Animal Farm. It was Animal Farm that they ran the presses overnight for. It was Animal Farm that people queued up to buy and to read, and it was Animal Farm that, of course, was a direct attack on Soviet communism. So I think the book was received in that light much more. I think it was received in a Cold War context. But I agree, it is a good example. And yes, the way people lazily refer to it now, of course, it's hilarious, particularly, I mean, you're a little younger than me, but particularly for people of my generation for whom it was absolutely required reading. You see it referenced all the time, and then you say to a young person, have you read it? And they go, no. So you sort of think, oh, God, it's just become a shibboleth that people utter.
I, for one, would not be here if it wasn't for the Irish language. I'm employed on a programme run by the US Department of State in 155 countries around the world because they valued having an Irish language speaker on their team. Irish is one of the 10 oldest languages still spoken in the world today, and in terms of literature, the oldest literatures we have in Europe are in Irish, in Greek, and in Latin. I think it would be an absolute travesty if we were to stop producing literature elsewhere and they were not taught in our schools, and I'd hate to see UK model being brought in here, where the requirement for a second language in the GCSEs was removed. Gurmí
Fine. And we all appreciate that too. And, wasn't it the greatest public relations coup of Elizabeth Windsor's long life was coming here and speaking in Irish properly. I don't know how properly she did it. I can't repeat the trick. That's all well and good. Nobody's knocking the Irish language or not recognizing any of those things or its importance. But bear in mind, the Irish Free State was established in 1921. You've had a long time of trying to get people to speak Irish. They're not speaking it, right? Can you not accept that? They really aren't. And it's not, you're going to tell me it's growing, or it's growing as a literary language?
It is growing. The amount of publications are increasing, and constantly there are new publications being created, like Tuairisc Puncaí is fantastic. online resource. And it has...
Online resource, not a literary novel.
There are literary novels produced also, and there are young people producing more literary.
Okay, well, fine. And maybe precisely its status as a kind of different kind of language, might be a way of putting it, will mean that it will continue to have a literature in that way. But I don't think you can argue that, for heaven's sake, Joyce didn't want to write in Irish.
Well, Seamus Heaney did, and unfortunately, he himself said he didn't have that ability to learn a second language, so for the
Who did?
Seamus Heaney.
Okay.
He even wrote that it was a travesty not to be able to write wonderful prose with Irish language and not learn to learn it.
Okay, but Joyce didn't, and he could have learned it in about a morning if he'd wanted. Okay, anybody else?
More questions? There's a couple of hands. That one?
In the unlikely event that you would read it, other than satiric verses or the Philosopher's Stone, what sort of books would you recommend to Mr. Trump to help him?
Well, I wouldn't recommend any at all. I mean, there was a lot of conversation when he gained power about how the American security services have a different method of briefing each new president, and they were wondering how they were going to have to brief Trump, because some presidents aren't very good at coping with a lot of type. And I think they're currently briefing him with puppet shows, actually. That's certainly the impression I'm gaining. What's the point in recommending books to somebody? I remember when having dinner with Martin Amis after he'd followed Tony Blair around for a week, and Blair, you recall, on Desert Island Discs, their unfailing indication of character, chose Ivanhoe as his book to take to a desert island, which occasioned considerable debate in the English press, and the conclusion was, undoubtedly rightly, that he simply hadn't read it, and that one of his ghastly PR flacks had suggested it would create the right impression for Desert Island. None of us regular Desert Island Discs listeners were fooled for a minute. But Martin followed Blair around for a week during the height of the Iraq crisis and everything, and I had dinner with him. I said, what did you make of him? And Martin paused for a moment and he said, I can tell you one thing, he's not a reader. That's Tony Blair. He clearly isn't a reader. Donald Trump, I don't think he could even read a menu, probably. I'm sorry, it's pointless. I mean, anybody who teaches here will have had many experiences, and it's an egregious to quote one's personal examples as if they were some kind of viable data set. But, on Thursday, I went into the university to teach a seminar on J.G. Ballard's Crash, so, quite close to, and none of my students had read the text. At all. But they all sat there quite happily. And after about an hour into the seminar, I was sort of asking, well, no, not that long. It took me about half an hour to realize that none of them had read a word. And that's students of English literature at a university, not some orange-haired megalomaniac hotelier who's stumbled into the Oval Office.
You mentioned Ronald Reagan, and you referred to him as the late screen actor. But I would point out that Ronald Reagan was a B-roll actor, and really his political career, which had begun by 1969, I think he was already governor of California, really began with a piece of long-form prose that he had written himself and recited, which is called A Time for Choosing. It's a half-hour long, and it's delivered in support of Barry Goldwater's failed candidacy for the United States.
Any
Reagan
good?
became the great communicator.
Any good?
Well, I wouldn't agree with Reaganite ideas. I'd say it's
Is it well written?
I would say so.
Well, I should read it this evening.
Especially the last 5 minutes. But
I bet it doesn't end. Yes.
my question is, if Ronald Reagan in his time and Barrack Obama in our own time are actually regarded as exceptional presidents largely on the things they say and the way they say them, do you think that says something that maybe modern culture isn't as illiterate as you seem to suggest?
I never found Reagan or Obama remotely impressive as speakers. No, not for a second. Tired cliches most of the time. Slogans and windy rhetoric. I've read Obama's book. It's serviceable. It's not literature. What are you talking about?
Well, I would say that unlike, say, the Germans, who don't value charismatic speeches as a kind of post-Hitler background, that our culture is influenced by the ability to speak, at least in a...
Well, was anybody here moved by Ronald Reagan's public speaking? I mean, his famous speech at the Berlin Wall, did that? Well, you weren't alive when that took place, but I was. I certainly wasn't moved. Anybody here who's older who felt themselves stirred by Reagan? I'm not talking about coming over to his ideological point of view. I'm just thinking, admiring the way he... I've always... Maybe I'm just too much of an old lefty. I could never see it with him. I certainly could never see it with Tony Blair. People used to talk about Blair as being a good orator. Really? Really? And no, I never saw it with Obama either. It just seemed to me, well, you know, not very good. Not very credible. But please dissent. Feel free to dissent. Rise up as one room and club me to death as the man who didn't recognize that Barrack Obama was a great political orator or Ronald Reagan. Feel free to do it. I'm happy to die under such circumstances. No, all right. But I will look at the Reagan piece. Have you read Why I Want to Fuck Ronald Reagan by J.G. Ballard? Okay, you read that and I'll read Reagan's speech. Be like a kind of swap. You'll get some of the content of my head and I'll get some of the content of yours. I wonder who'll be calmer.
Actually, in the George Bush's first election, a group of agitprop Americans took hold of Why I Want to Fuck Ronald Reagan, and they printed it and took it to the primary and handed it out to Republicans. But they put a cover on it which said it was the manifesto of George Bush. No one seemed to notice.
No one noticed. But Liam raises another interesting point, which is, you know, I could have talked about this for another hour, which is the death of the avant-garde. And that's another reason why there is no influence, reciprocal influence between literary fiction and the realm of real political events anymore. It's because we don't have an avant-garde to outrage, to be banned. And it's a bit like what you were saying about the kind of totalitarianism we live in. You know, again, the older people here will remember, particularly here in Ireland, how puritanical cultures were in the past and how, you know, there really were taboos being enacted. And now we live in a society, as I think I've amply demonstrated this evening, where you can say anything you bloody well please. Chances are that nobody's listening is the point, you know, because everybody else is talking at the top of their mouth as well.
Surely there's enough provocation here for a few more questions. Anyone? Comments? There's one and there's one. Yeah.
Do you think they're involving creatures who are going to be unable to read long-form novels?
Yes.
Like myself, I'm so easily distracted.
Yeah.
Pile of books beside the bed, but I'm reaching for the iPad and
Yes.
really short.
Yes, and imagine if you read on the iPad, how difficult it would be to stay in. Yeah, I don't think I think we're going to change. I think we already are changing. You know, my children's generation is significantly different in all sorts of ways to my generation, possibly loosely your generation. We see a real alteration. I'm not necessarily super pessimistic about it. I'm not like Susan Greenfield. I don't think that bidirectional digital technology can alter the gross anatomy of the brain. That would seem a bit implausible, and I'm surprised that Greenfield, who's an eminent neuroscientist herself, would ever think such a thing. But I think it's altering mind. It's altering mind both individually and collectively. It's altering our sense of what reality is, what ontology, our ontological perspective, and it's altering epistemology quite profoundly, what it is to know something, and the importance of knowing something, which is where I really started, this idea that for us who have Gutenberg minds, we worked hard to build canonical knowledge because we didn't have an iPhone in our pocket. And it was absolutely a sine qua non of being cultured that you had that canonical knowledge. And that's just simply no longer important. Why do you need to have that canonical knowledge? You know, it seems to be the best that as pedagogues we can do for our students at the moment is to try and teach them savoir-faire, try and teach them how to figure out what's going on with the filter bubble. So maybe, but the new forms that are going to be the equivalent of what literary fiction was for earlier generations haven't quite evolved yet. They'll come though, I'm sure. I don't think people are getting any stupider. It's just intelligence is developing in a different direction and different form. It's just the case. Nobody feels bad about not reading literary fiction anymore. Nobody feels any shame about it, that they haven't read the classics. Or, you know, you must have experienced it all over the last 10 years. You might have woke up sometime about 6 years ago and thought, I don't have to read À la recherche du temps perdu. It's fine. I don't have to read it anymore. Nobody's ever going to call me out on that again. I'm never going to be at a party in which people are talking about all the amazing books they've read and I feel small. It's not going to happen. Hooray!
So all those David Lodge satires are
They're no longer satiric.
they're no longer satirical. It was a
Yeah, I was just wondering what you thought of Huckleberry Finn. Seems to be a great novel and has appears, I thought, to have such a disastrous ending.
Disastrous ending. I think it's a great, great novel, and I don't agree at all with the kind of attacks on it. That I was reading the famous Nigerian Nobel laureate, I can't remember where he attacked Heart of Darkness and Huckleberry Finn as well. I mean, it is a problematic text in some ways, particularly for African American people, I would imagine, quite reasonably, but it's a great, great novel. But that's another good example. Not a huge, big seller at its time, Huckleberry Finn, but look back to the 19th century. What were the highest selling books in the English-speaking world in the 19th century? Were Uncle Tom's Cabin, and number 2, Looking Backward by, what's he called? Bellamy. So, Uncle Tom's Cabin, okay, by the standards of today, it doesn't look that enlightened or progressive, but by the standards of its own day, it certainly bloody was. It was enormously influential in terms... Changed America, exactly. Looking Backward, political party founded off the back of this book, a science fiction utopian novel that foretold a kind of corporatist resolution between capital and labor in a future state, foretold shopping malls, high-speed communication systems. There's even something a bit webby in it, I think, and they have credit cards. It was such an influential book that the Progressive Party was founded off the back of it. You can go in Los Angeles to the Bradbury Building, which is the building that features coincidentally, or perhaps non-coincidentally, in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, which was built according to Bellamyite principles. So it even influenced architecture, this book. And I can't think of anything comparable in our own era at all. We just don't look to books in that way. But Huck Finn, yeah, if you haven't read it, strike out for the territory.
if there's any left.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
You mentioned those so-called fine speeches, the no jure, but they were all written by the backroom boys anyway. I mean, Lincoln wrote to Mrs. Bixby, and he wrote the Gettysburg Address. Is there any politician whom you admire?
No, I can't think of any politicians that I positively admire. I mean, I recognise that plenty of them are doing their best, but I think it's precisely for the reason you mentioned.
But then are we all hurlers on the ditch? We kind of diss our politicians, but we do nothing about it.
Yeah, but it's a bit like the totalitarianism of, you know, the willing totalitarianism. We're willing victims of our own political impasse. I mean, we're taking the discussion wider. I think the problems we face, frankly, are so difficult and intractable that it paralyzes us. And we tend to look at the political class, and I'm sure it's the same here in Dublin as it is in London. We look at them and you know, dependent upon their flacks to write their speeches, marginally, if not totally corrupt, or as they often are, we still think, well, I don't want to do that, and you know, as long as they aren't making too many waves, we'll leave them to it. Because there's a sense that the problems we face are really, really difficult, and if we make too much of a noise, if we actually try to effect some sort of regime change, we'd then be responsible, which is how we all feel, I'm sure, about the Brexiteers in England, which is, you know, they've done this thing predicated on the idea of a massive reinvigoration of civic society, of democracy. You know, let's wait and see if that actually happens in England. I mean, I haven't seen anybody doing anything but what they normally do, which is wander around scratching their arse. You know, I haven't seen, I've seen no evidence. And back to your point about they don't even write their own speeches, where is the rhetoric that could sustain this? It just doesn't work.
Well, sorry to book back in on that, but is there something in political rhetoric that it can either bring out your worst selves or your best selves, and that maybe what, say, Kennedy was doing, okay, Sorensen was writing the speeches, but the effect of his rhetoric, or the effect of Obama's rhetoric, even if you don't like the writing, was to maybe encourage in people the idea of rising to be their best selves. Now, okay, we've had a backlash to all of that, clearly, but if you have a moment when a politician is standing up and is encouraging the best in you, that there's a chance there for something.
Well, I mean, we're getting on to wider issues, but I think it's, you know, we're in a political culture, and certainly have been since the 60s to some extent, in which it's civil society and civil institutions that are fraying. People don't feel the natural connection between their engagement, you know, from family to community to wider society. And if you know, that's where the problem lies. It doesn't matter how high-flown the rhetoric is, if people are not in a kind of environment in which their positive inclinations are given institutional form all around them, then they're not going to do anything. That's what we saw with Obama. Hope, hope, hope. But what then? Keep Guantanamo open, increase drone strikes, you know. Kennedy. Ask not what the country can do, ask what you can do for the country. I'll tell you what the country can do for you. It can send you to Vietnam, which is what he did. He sent the first troops into Vietnam. Come on, guys, let's eat.